I'm Dane Rose. 4 years ago, dealing with suicidal depression and a real success crisis because so much of my life had come together, and as our culture likes to promise us in the American dream, when you've got money, when you've got work, when you're debt-free, when you've got an ideal lifestyle, then you'll be happy. And when you've got all the various gadgets and things that our culture likes to sell us. But that wasn't happening. What was going on instead was like, what the fuck? I thought getting to this milepost was going to make me feel better. But with more time on my hands, what was actually surfacing without my ability to put language to it was childhood traumas from the past that had never been dealt with. And I thought that anything would have been dealt with in the $150,000 of therapy that I'd done up to that point. But it turned out that none of the practitioners that I worked with were trauma literate. They didn't notice the traumatic symptoms. And so I'd tried diet, I'd tried consumerism, I'd tried travel, I tried massage and acupuncture, and, I didn't know what else to do. And so I hired a therapist for a psychedelic session, and it was a disaster. So I hired, this was with MDMA, following some of the books talking about the protocols for treating Iraqi veterans. You can read about that in Acid Test. Then I tried another therapist, and that was a disaster. It was a combination of MDMA and psilocybin. I fell in love with the therapist, a male therapist. I'm heterosexual in general. During the session, he escalated a sexual relationship in the dynamic. Then I think he came to his senses and was terrified because he'd lied to his wife, he'd lied to his colleagues who'd recommended him to me, and then began a cover-up, which, as I tried to piece together a broken heart, what had happened in the session, escalated into PTSD with the shame secrecy protocol that so many abusers use. And, I didn't know what trauma or PTSD was until I stumbled into a cafe, asked a young man what he was doing that next coming weekend, and he said he was going to take a workshop on trauma. I said, "What's that? Tell me about it." And he described all of my symptoms. And I thought this was stunning, to be learning one of the most important psychological kind of pieces of data of my life from a stranger in a cafe, and not from any of the therapists that I'd worked with. And the fear, the shame, denial, etc., I developed, chronic fatigue. I couldn't work. I was in so much pain, I started consciously addicting to both sleep and food just to get through the day. And this kind of led to more pain in a couple of year periods than I'd experienced in the rest of my lifetime combined. It, of course, totally shot, a lot of my trust in therapists. I did my own reading of, I would highlight Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, and just trying to find out how to come back in a culture that is pathologically designed to ignore opportunities for prevention, and then generally punishes the people who are most abused by making them feel socially unwanted as they demonstrate traumatic symptoms that are very hard to put language to in a culture that is traumatically illiterate. And the more I grappled with this, the more frustrated I became with this awareness that our culture takes millions of its citizens and puts them through abuse and traumatic protocols in parenting, and then, as in some cases, in therapeutic and various other forms of relationship abuse. And it was very difficult to fit what I was feeling physiologically, in other words, into any kind of a therapeutic protocol that I could find. Because, I lost track of time. So therapists demanding that I show up at a set time at their location and then spout my feelings for a convenient amount of a time for them and then disappear again, that wasn't working. And so I read all the literature, all of Bessel van der Kolk's work. There's The Body Keeps the Score, but he's also participated in, another book with colleagues. I think it's called Traumatic Stress. Anyway, there's another book on that, and Peter Levine's work. And I read Alice Miller. I looked at John Bradshaw's work on shame and healing, because shame is a trauma. Brené Brown's work. Basically anything in that field I took an interest in. And I couldn't read, so I listened on Audible. And I feel extraordinarily lucky because I had savings at the time. So when my inability to work, blew up in my face, I could live on savings. And I knew about more empathic parts of the world, because it just seemed crazy trying to deal with this in the United States, where I could someone say, "How you doing?" And I could tell them, and they'd be like, okay, catch you around, and it's like, is this how we respond to people in excruciating overwhelm, pain, and crisis? And it seems like the answer is, in our cult, yes. And it's really not okay with me, because going back to that sense of feeling lucky, I'd written books about relationships by this point. I'd had, a number of pretty healthy relationships. I had, as I say, more than $100,000 of various therapies under my belt. I knew what I wanted. I owned my own business, and I was barely getting through this debacle. And I kept going to the question, how's a 17-year-old who's addicting with alcohol and being sexually abused going to go through this sociopathic protocol? Where are they going to go to get help? And understanding that many therapists can be unconsciously, more destructive than helpful in this terrain. And it grates on me. It grates on me that our culture gives traumatically illiterate parents that come from highly dysfunctional families, many of us do, the right to care for the innocence of a newborn child, and then protects the parent, but not the child, which damages esteem, it damages social skills, it damages brain chemistry, all of which create big impedances to a successful life, including suppressing income and simultaneously increasing medical bills. And then our response to that is to say, well, go hand yourself over to an often incompetent therapist who's going to take more of that money you don't have to do what they do, which, in my experience, doesn't often work. When it doesn't work, as I've grumbled and complained to therapists, they are quick to point out that it works for some of their clients, and the clear implication is they're doing their job, and it must be the victim's fault if they're not getting well. This would be like going to a hospital with gangrene and being injected with morphine or something like that, coming out with gangrene and being told, well, some people get well in our hospital. What's wrong with you? I deeply believe that each of us have an innate drive to become more, that's innate in the human species, and that when we find ourselves in tailspins of destructiveness, pain, isolation, etc., that it is not because our fundamental nature is flawed, but rather that in an emotionally illiterate, traumatically illiterate, psychologically illiterate culture that is highly chauvinistic in its incessant bias towards ever more luxury and materialism, while neglecting the emotional psyche in each one of us to the degree that you and I can go through the entire education system without a single formal hour of emotional training, is itself a pathological culture. The problem is not with the babies being born, it is the culture in which they're born into. And part of what is pathological is the message. There's something fucked up with you, not the culture. So go and get it fixed and pay money to correct your flaws, as opposed to receiving support in any way to correct the shames, the traumas, the ignorance, the fear, and all of the dysfunction, that our culture is generous in its bestowing upon those born into it. It's been a hellish ride in many ways to come to this point. However, I can say that I've never been better in this whole kind of terrain. I've looked deeply at the opportunities for post-traumatic growth, which happens in a minority of cases because we don't know how to deal with trauma in our culture. And so I am not a therapist. I am not a psychological professional. I don't want to, in any way, receive money for just helping out as a human being. What I found most useful in this terrain was understanding how much of this is not personal. It's cultural. It's going on in millions of American households as we speak, which is bizarre and incredibly destructive. It's sociopathic that we are so silent in the midst of so much suffering. But I wanted to do a couple of things. I felt very alone in this entire process. There was one woman in Thailand who had nothing to do with the abuse who gave enormous amounts of support. I couldn't find anyone in the United States that responded empathically and helpful to a degree that seemed proportionate to the crisis. And many made it worse with messages that it didn't matter, that they were too busy, and this and that and the other. And so the first thing I wanted to do was provide, I guess, a companionship that I didn't receive, simply by saying, "Here's me along the journey." And so in the trauma diary kind of section, it's basically me going through day by day years of hell, with the primary notion I don't want other people to be in this amount of pain and be alone. And as I learn things, etc., I share them. I try and validate the feelings that I'm, was experiencing, and piece them together, share any insight, share what was working. What I wanted to do in this kind of trauma circle was distill the parts of that might be useful for you. And I'm one individual with one temperament, with one perspective in a given circumstance in my generation. And so for someone like me in my generation, in somewhat similar circumstances, this is likely to be helpful, or at least provide a counterpoint, something to consider. For others of you, large amounts of this will just be off base, off target for what you're dealing with and the perspectives with which you're approaching this. But I nonetheless, even the books that I read where I thought, that doesn't work, I don't relate to that, it was still helpful in clarifying what I did and didn't relate to. And so my goal, my wish with this project, is that you sample. If you're going through trauma, if you have PTSD, if you've been dealing with sexual abuse, if you've been dealing with psychedelic trauma, all of which was in the terrain that I navigated, that you see what bits of this works for you. And the other message that I wanted to give was that what's happening here is not right, and it's not your fault. We should be, by this stage, an emotionally literate culture, but we are not. We should be psychologically illiterate because we all have a psyche, we all navigate through it, and it would make our culture 10 times richer if we could navigate that terrain with grace, with love, with excellence, as opposed to the bumbling mess that we tend to make of it. And finally, that you do matter. This kind of psychological pain is some of the most horrific pain that a person can go through. I broke my elbow in the middle of all this. That was nothing. I was in 8, 9, 10 physical pain with broken bones and a dangling arm. That's nothing compared to the amount of shame and loneliness that one can experience in a dysfunctional culture that is this psychologically illiterate and this sociopathic. And you may and hopefully do have some supportive family members. Many of the most traumatized people do not, because they were first abused in their family. Then the abuse was buried under messages of love that creates insanity and cross-wiring. And then the abuse is repeated in an adult stage. And when it's repeated, they don't have a safe family to go to. They have an abusive family to fall back on. And heaven help you if you're relying on the U.S. government to do anything sane or intelligent when you're in this state. And it is, I think, horrific that the best that we can do is say, go pay lots of money to a therapist who may or may not know what they're doing in a convenient format for that therapist, which may or may not be what you need, and hopefully you'll get better, and many don't, and if not, tough luck. So this circle is my, referencing a lot of my own journey back to recovery. Towards that minority of people that experience what's called post-traumatic growth. And I wanted to map it all out so that your odds of experiencing post-traumatic growth would go up. And if you're not dealing with trauma, thank goodness, and you have someone you care about or someone in your community who is, and you want to increase your competency, there's a beautiful circle that begins with love. Love leads to caring. Caring leads to intimacy, to understanding. You take the time to figure out who the other person is and what's going on. This leads naturally to attunement. Once you understand the other person, you can attune to the other person. Attuning to the other person leads to success, leads to competence in a healthy, nurturing relationship. Competence leads to excellence, which leads to joy, to gratitude, and back to love. If we love ourselves and our culture enough, we will take the time and the discipline and the attention to become competent. Competency will lead to success, which leads to well-being, which naturally results in gratitude and love. This is the journey that we need to take as a culture, and we're stumbling hesitantly into it with the Me Too movement, with more discussion about trauma, with more and more literature out there. We're stumbling into it. But we have a long way to go. And I want to invite you to participate actively in being a leader in this culture. If you are in severe trauma, you are carrying the data of our culture's ignorance, fear, and its wound. And you are carrying the data that this culture needs in order to grow. And so how to give it back, how to complete the feedback loop so that our culture has a chance to survive and so that you can heal and reintegrate. And similarly, if you are not in trauma at this time, etc., but are interested, the information that I'm sharing here is my distillation out of a long journey, personally trying everything, noticing what works, and that's really its purpose. If you throw any portion of this away that doesn't work, but find something that does, that will make me very happy. Trauma is costing our economy trillions of dollars over time. It is dampening the vitality and health of our culture. Many of our children, the most innocent and least worthy of it, are asked to carry the burden of our ignorance and our incompetence. And it's got to stop sometime. And I think it stops when people like you and I decide to do something about it. And my own effort, along with a nonprofit that I fund, Happiness Data, is simply to tell the story and to share what's worked. Good luck and enjoy the circle.